The morning I heard my son's girlfriend say, "Once we're married, he won't need to check in with his family so much," I nearly spilled a full pot of dark roast coffee across a white tablecloth set for 12. I stood there, maybe 4 feet away, in a black vest and pressed white shirt, holding a silver carafe like I'd been holding one my whole life. She was facing the window, phone pressed to her ear, looking out at the marina. She didn't even glance in my direction. People rarely look at the man refilling their coffee. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why, I need to take you back about 4 months. My name is Walt Greer. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived in Savannah, Georgia for most of my life. For 32 years, I worked as a structural engineer, bridge projects, highway overpasses, commercial foundations, the kind of work where a miscalculation doesn't just cost money, it costs lives. I retired the year I turned 61. My wife, Carol, had been looking forward to it for years. She'd made a whole list: travel, gardening, Saturday mornings with nowhere to be. What she didn't plan for was me standing in the kitchen at 7 a.m., asking her what she wanted for breakfast when she'd already eaten. After about 8 months of that, I needed something to do with my hands in my mornings. A friend of mine, Dennis Park, had a small catering and hospitality staffing company, the kind that provides servers, bartenders, and event staff for private clubs, corporate dinners, and waterfront weddings. He'd been trying to get me to help him part-time for years. Nothing strenuous. Mostly coordinating setup, occasionally working events when he was short-staffed. I started in January. By March, I was working 3 or 4 events a week. Private dining rooms, yacht club brunches, corporate retreats at the historic hotels downtown. I wore the uniform black vest, white shirt, name tag that said Walt in small block letters, and I poured coffee and carried plates and mostly stayed invisible, the way good service staff always do. The truth is, I liked it. There was a quiet satisfaction in it that was hard to explain. After 30 years of being the one people looked to for answers, it was almost restful to be the person nobody noticed. That's how I ended up working the monthly business networking luncheon at the Harborview Club. Every second Thursday, same crowd, mostly. Real estate developers, attorneys, financial advisors, a few contractors I recognized from my engineering days. I'd been working that event for 6 weeks when she first walked in. Her name was Serena Voss, 34 years old. Dark hair, sharp eyes, the kind of poise that reads as confidence from across a room. She'd come as the guest of a commercial property investor named Douglas Burke, and the two of them were clearly more than professional acquaintances based on the way she leaned toward him when she talked. I didn't give her a second thought. Not until the following Thursday when my son called me on the drive home. "Hey Dad, you free Saturday? I want you to meet Serena." I nearly missed the turn onto my street. My son, Marcus, is 36 years old. He's a physical therapist with a practice he built from nothing after working 12-hour days for the better part of a decade. He's kind, steady, and I say this knowing every father thinks this about his son, genuinely one of the best people I know. He'd had one serious relationship in his late 20s that ended hard, and after that, he'd been cautious. Carol used to worry he was too cautious. She'd stopped worrying about that, apparently, because when Marcus talked about Serena, his voice had a warmth in it I hadn't heard in a long time. "She sounds wonderful," I told him, and I meant it. We met Saturday for dinner at a seafood restaurant near the river. Serena was charming, well-spoken, and clearly smart. She asked Carol about her garden. She asked me about my engineering career, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She laughed at Marcus's jokes in a way that didn't seem performed. By the end of the evening, Carol squeezed my hand under the table. Driving home, she said, "I really like her." "Me too," I said. And I did. Completely. At that point, I had no reason not to. The following Thursday, I was back at the Harborview Club, setting up glassware at the far end of the main dining room when the doors opened and the usual crowd began filtering in. Serena walked in with Douglas Burke again. I noticed her immediately, but I kept my expression neutral and my focus on the table in front of me. She didn't look my way. Why would she? To her, I was just a man in a black vest arranging water glasses near the window. She was different here than she'd been at dinner on Saturday. Harder, somehow, more precise. She spoke to Douglas in a low, clipped voice, and whatever they were discussing wasn't casual. At one point, I moved close enough to refresh their water and caught a few words. "The timeline depends on him not knowing until it's done." I moved away. Told myself it was business. Could have been anything. A real estate deal, a contract negotiation, none of my concern. But the phrase stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. The following Thursday was when she made the phone call I described at the beginning. Standing near the window at the far end of the room, back to me, phone to her ear. The comment about Marcus not needing to check in with his family so much. I set the carafe down on the service station and walked to the kitchen. Dennis was there, checking his clipboard. He looked up. "You okay? You look pale." "Fine," I said. "Just need a minute." I stood at the stainless steel prep counter and breathed. Told myself I'd heard it wrong, or out of context, or that it had been a joke. The kind of thing people say without meaning anything by it. I drove home that evening and didn't say a word to Carol. For 5 days I carried it alone. I kept replaying the exact words, the exact tone, not the words of a woman making an offhand comment, the words of a woman describing a plan she'd already thought through. On the 5th day, Carol found me sitting on the back porch after dinner staring at nothing. She sat down beside me. She didn't say anything for a while. That's one of the things I've always loved about her. She knows the difference between silence that needs to be filled and silence that needs to be kept. Finally, she asked, "Is this about Serena?" I looked at her. "You've been somewhere else all week," she said quietly. I told her what I'd heard, both things, the Marina comment and the fragment from the week before about a timeline and someone not knowing until it was done. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her glass down on the porch rail. "What exactly does she do for work?" Carol asked. I realized I wasn't entirely sure. Marcus had said something about commercial consulting, but when I thought about it, I didn't have a clear picture. "I need to find out," I said. "Yes," Carol agreed, "but carefully." That was the right word, carefully. Because I'd been a father long enough to know what happened when you push too hard, too fast against someone your child loved. You didn't change their mind, you just became the problem. And I wasn't willing to lose Marcus over a feeling and 2 overheard sentences. So I watched. And I kept working Thursdays at the Harborview Club. Over the next 3 weeks, I learned a great deal just by being invisible. Serena attended the luncheon every week with Douglas Burke. Their dynamic was professional on the surface, but something else underneath. He deferred to her more than she deferred to him, which was interesting. She did most of the talking in their private conversations. At one point, I was clearing a table nearby when I heard her say, clearly and without lowering her voice, "The account transfer can't happen before the wedding. It needs to look organic." Account transfer. The wedding. I walked back to the kitchen with 2 empty bread baskets and stood very still for a moment. Marcus had mentioned that Serena was old-fashioned about finances. That she'd suggested, once they were married, they consolidate everything into a joint account for simplicity. Marcus had told me this the way someone shares a cute detail about a partner fond, a little amused, entirely unsuspecting. I went home that evening and sat with Carol at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I told her everything I'd heard, in order, as clearly as I could remember it. Carol is a former middle school principal. She spent 30 years reading people for a living. She listened with her hands folded and her expression very still. When I finished, she said, "You can't tell him yet. I know. He'll defend her. And then she'll know you're watching." I know that too. Carol looked at me across the table. "You need something real, Walt. Not impressions, not fragments. Something he can hold in his hands." She was right. Impressions were just a father's fear dressed up as intuition. I needed facts. I want to be honest about the next part, because it didn't always feel good. There were days I questioned everything. Serena would call Marcus on a Sunday, and I'd hear her voice through the phone speaker, warm, easy, clearly delighted by him, and I'd sit there wondering if I was the problem. If I was one of those fathers who couldn't accept that his son had built a life that didn't center on him. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with. I brought it up to Carol one night. She thought about it. Then she said, "Are you doing this because you're worried about Marcus? Or because you don't like sharing him?" That landed hard, the way honest questions usually do. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. "Both," I finally said. "But the things I heard were real. I didn't imagine them." Carol nodded. "Then keep going, but check yourself every step." That became my rule. Every time I felt the anger rising, and it did rise, more than I expected, I asked myself that question. Is this about Marcus, or is this about me? Most of the time it was Marcus. And that kept me moving. 2 weeks later, I got the clearest piece of information yet, and I didn't have to go looking for it. Serena came to the Harbor View Club luncheon with a different companion, not Douglas Burke, a woman named Claire, based on what I heard when they greeted each other. They took a corner table, and I was assigned to their section for the afternoon. They spoke quietly enough that I caught only portions, but the portions I caught were enough. "He doesn't know about the Portland deal," Serena said at one point. "Does he need to?" the woman Claire replied. "Not until after the ceremony. By then the structure is already in place." A pause. I set down 2 glasses of iced water and moved away at a normal pace. Portland. Marcus had mentioned that Serena was interested in them eventually relocating to the Pacific Northwest. He'd said it the way someone mentions a dream, vague, far off, not urgent. He'd even said it sounded kind of exciting. I made it to the kitchen before my hands started shaking. Marcus had told me something else recently. Serena had brought up a prenuptial agreement. He'd mentioned it casually, the way you'd mention someone suggesting a new restaurant. Serena had framed it as smart financial planning. She'd said she wanted to protect him as much as herself. Marcus had said he respected her for bringing it up first. He hadn't told me the details of what was in it. I thought about that on the drive home. A prenuptial agreement that Serena had drafted and proposed. A joint account consolidation that she'd suggested. A property deal in Portland that Marcus knew nothing about. And a comment about a wedding timeline being the trigger for a financial structure to fall into place. None of those things individually were illegal. None of them individually were even necessarily wrong. But together they told a story. And the story was not the one Marcus believed he was living. I called a man named Roy Clifton the next morning. Roy had been a financial crimes investigator for the state before he retired. We'd known each other for 15 years through a mutual friend. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has spent his entire career being shown the worst of human nature and still isn't bitter about it. We met at a diner off Abercorn Street on a Tuesday morning. I laid out everything I knew, in order. Roy listened over scrambled eggs and black coffee. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "You're describing a pattern, not a crime." "I know. A pattern of someone positioning herself financially before a marriage without her partner's full knowledge." "Yes." Roy looked at me. "That's not nothing, but you're right that it's not enough." He paused. "What you need is documentation, not accusations. Not your word against hers. Something on paper that Marcus can verify independently." "How?" "Start with what you can confirm publicly," Roy said. "Her business structure. The Portland deal she mentioned, if it's a real estate transaction, it'll leave a paper trail eventually. The joint account suggestion, does Marcus have a financial advisor? He did. An old college friend named Ben who'd been managing Marcus's retirement accounts for years. Get Marcus talking to Ben before anything gets consolidated," Roy said, casually. Not, "I'm worried about your girlfriend." Just, "Hey, have you looped Ben in on the financial planning?" Plant the question without raising the alarm. That was good advice. Better than anything I'd come up with on my own. I did it that weekend. Called Marcus under the pretense of asking how the practice was doing, and then slipped in the question about Ben the way Roy had suggested. Casual, interested, nothing loaded about it. Marcus paused. "Actually, I've been meaning to do that. Serena and I have been talking about combining accounts, and I probably should loop Ben in." "That sounds smart," I said. I hung up the phone and sat very still for a moment. Marcus didn't know that Serena's name had come up recently in connection with a real estate holding company I'd asked Roy to look into. He didn't know that the company had a pending deal in Portland that was structured through a trust. He didn't know that his girlfriend had been having lunch every week with a man named Douglas Burke, who was a primary investor in that trust. He didn't know any of it, because she hadn't told him. I spent the following month doing something I'm not entirely proud of in retrospect, even though I believe it was necessary. I documented everything, quietly, carefully, legally, nothing intrusive, nothing that required surveillance or deception. I kept a written log of every overheard conversation with dates and locations. I saved a copy of the Harbor View Club event schedules. I asked Roy to pull whatever public business records he could on Serena's LLC. What he found wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A series of financial structures that were, on their own, completely standard. But assembled together, they suggested that Serena had been building a framework that would, post-marriage, give her significant legal access to Marcus's assets in a way that wasn't immediately obvious from the surface of the prenuptial agreement, as Marcus had described it to me. Roy put it plainly over the phone one afternoon. She may genuinely care about your son. I can't tell you one way or the other. What I can tell you is that she's made financial arrangements that suggest she's thought carefully about what happens if things go wrong. More carefully than most people do. And your son doesn't appear to know the extent of it. That evening, I drove over to Marcus's house uninvited for the first time in years. He was in the kitchen making dinner. He looked surprised to see me, then concerned. Dad, everything okay? Can I sit down? We sat at his kitchen table, and I told him. Not everything, not the full depth of the documentation, not Roy's name, not the scope of what I'd been doing. I told him what I'd overheard both times, and what it had led me to look into, and what I'd found. I spoke slowly. I didn't use words like scheme or manipulate. I said, there are some financial arrangements I've learned about that you may not have full visibility into, and I think you should talk to Ben before anything gets consolidated. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, how do you know any of this? And I told him about the Harborview Club, all of it, the uniform, the catering job, the months of working Thursday lunches without ever saying a word to Serena. He stared at me. She's there every week? And you never said anything to her? She doesn't know who I am. Dad, he pushed back from the table. I don't even know how to. He stopped, started again. Why didn't you just tell me? And I gave him the most honest answer I had. Because the first time I tried with someone you loved, you were 28 years old, and I handled it badly, and it took us a year to get back to where we were. I wasn't willing to do that again, not without being sure. He was quiet again. A different kind of quiet. I need to talk to Serena, he finally said. I know, but talk to Ben first. He looked at me across the table. He didn't look angry exactly. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the floor of a room he'd been standing in was not as solid as he'd assumed, which, in a way, was exactly the situation. He talked to Ben 2 days later. Ben asked to see the prenuptial agreement. What he found in it, specifically in the section governing asset distribution in the event of dissolution, was not what Marcus had understood it to be, based on the way Serena had described it to him. Ben called Marcus. Marcus called me. Ben says I need an independent attorney to review this before I sign anything. That sounds right, I said. 2 days after that, Marcus asked Serena about the Portland deal. He didn't tell her where the question came from. He just asked, casually over dinner, whether she'd been looking at any Pacific Northwest real estate opportunities recently. She told him no. He asked about Douglas Burke. The pause that followed, from what Marcus told me later, was long enough to answer the question by itself. They talked for 3 hours that night. Some of what he learned, he shared with me. Some of it he kept private, and I didn't push. What I know is that by the end of the conversation, Marcus had a clear picture of several financial arrangements Serena had been building quietly, without his knowledge, in anticipation of their marriage. He also had a clear picture of who she had been spending Thursday lunchtimes with. She denied, at first, that any of it was significant. Then she said that Marcus had a tendency to be overly cautious and that she'd only been planning for their shared future. Then, when he showed her what Ben had flagged in the prenuptial language, she went quiet. She asked me how I found out, Marcus told me on the phone. I told her my dad had been working the catering at the Harborview Club for 4 months, and she'd never once looked at the man refilling her water glass. There was a long pause on the line between us. What did she say? I asked. She didn't say anything, Marcus said. She just sat there. I didn't know what to feel in that moment. Not satisfaction. Nothing close to that. More like the feeling after a long bridge project was finally signed off. Not joy exactly, but a settled kind of stillness. The work was done. The structure was sound. The weeks that followed were complicated. Marcus didn't call every day. When he did call, his voice was quieter than usual, more careful. He was processing something large, and he was doing it in the private way he'd always handled difficult things. Carol let him have the space. I tried to do the same, though it didn't come as naturally to me. About 6 weeks later, he came over for Sunday dinner. Carol made the pot roast he's loved since he was 12. We ate at the kitchen table, and for the first half of the meal, we talked about other things: his practice, a new patient, success story he was proud of, some work Carol was doing in the garden. Normal things, good things. At some point, he put his fork down. "I'm not angry at you," he said. I looked at him. I was for a while. "The way you went about it," he paused. "But I've been thinking about it a lot, and I understand why you did it the way you did. I should have come to you sooner," I said. "Maybe," he picked up his fork again. "But you gave me enough time to see it myself. That matters." Carol looked across the table at him. "Are you okay?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think so." I keep reminding myself that she might have meant well. That people can genuinely believe they're planning for a shared future, even when they're not actually including you in the planning. He looked up. "I've seen that with patients too. People who think they know what's best for someone else and stop asking." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. He's been seeing a good counselor since then, which was his own idea, and which I think is one of the wisest things he's done. His practice is doing well. He plays golf on Saturdays with a group of friends he's known for years, which he'd let slide during the relationship, and I can hear the difference in his voice when he mentions it. He still hasn't asked me to stop working at the Harborview Club, for what it's worth. And I haven't stopped. Dennis says I'm the best addition he's made to his team in 5 years, which I'm fairly certain means I show up on time and don't drop things. That's enough for me. Last month, Marcus called me on a Thursday afternoon, right after I'd finished an event and was changing out of the black vest in Dennis's van. "Hey," he said, "you working today?" "Just finished. Anyone interesting come in?" I laughed. It came out easier than I expected. "Not today." "Good." A pause. Then quietly, "Thanks, Dad." I sat there in the parking lot of the Harborview Club for a minute before I started the car. The late afternoon sun was coming in low off the water. Seagulls were doing their thing. A family was walking the pier in the distance, 2 little kids running ahead of their parents. I thought about something Roy had told me the morning we sat in that diner off Abercorn Street. He'd said, "The hardest part of what you're doing isn't finding the truth. It's trusting that the person you love can handle it once you give it to them." I hadn't been sure he was right at the time. I was sure now. I started the car and drove home to Carol, and the 2 old chairs on our back porch, and the sound of cicadas in the oaks behind our fence. And I was grateful, the way you're only truly grateful for ordinary things when you've come close to losing them. Some fathers think protecting your son means standing in front of him. I've learned it means something different. It means staying close enough to see clearly, being patient enough to wait for the right moment, and trusting him enough to hand him the truth and step back. The rest belongs to him. Thank you for listening. Sometimes the most important thing a parent can do is resist the urge to act too quickly. Walt didn't storm in with accusations or ultimatums. He watched, he waited, and when the moment came, he handed his son the truth and stepped back. That kind of love takes real discipline. It trusts the other person to be strong enough to handle what's real. And that trust, more often than not, is exactly what brings them home. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while leaving behind something worth holding on to. A quiet reminder that love, at its best, knows when to speak and when to simply stay close.